Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we'll be taking a closer look at psilocybin mushrooms. Those magic mushrooms everyone's talking about.
Definitely a fascinating topic. Lots to explore there.
We'll be pulling from the Wikipedia article, as usual, for this deep dive. And today, we're aiming to figure out not just what these mushrooms are, but also the effects of psilocybin, and of course, the whole history and cultural significance of their use. Sounds good.
Absolutely. Sounds like a plan.
Awesome. So, first things first, what exactly are we talking about when we say psilocybin mushrooms?
Well, it's not just one mushroom, really. It's a whole bunch of different fungi, all containing this psychoactive compound, psilocybin. They're in a few different genera, but the most potent ones are often from the psilocybe genus.
Psilocybe, like Psilocybe cubensis. I feel like that's the one I always hear about.
Exactly. That's probably the most well-known.
So how does this psilocybin actually work, to produce these magic effects?
Well, when you ingest psilocybin, your liver actually converts it to psilocin, and it's psilocin that's interacting with your brain to create that psychedelic experience.
So it's kind of a two-step process. The psilocybin is like converted into psilocin, and then that's what gets you.
Precisely. And the way it does that is by binding to these specific serotonin receptors in the brain, particularly this thing called the 5-HT2A receptor.
Serotonin. Now that sounds familiar. Isn't that the mood thing, like what antidepressants target?
Yeah, that's it. And that's why researchers are finding psilocybin so interesting. Because by sort of messing with these serotonin pathways, it can totally change your emotions, perceptions, even your thoughts.
Okay, so that makes sense. Now I really want to know, what does a psilocybin trip feel like?
Well, as you can imagine, it's very subjective, very personal. Depends on the individual, how much you take, the setting. But there are some common threads. A lot of people report these visual distortions, like seeing colors super vividly or seeing patterns and even hallucinations sometimes.
That's what's always fascinated me about psychedelics. Like it opens up a different way of seeing the world. What about like the emotional side? I've heard some people feel super euphoric and others get anxious.
Yeah, the emotional effects are just as powerful as the visual changes. Some people have this intense joy, feeling connected, even spiritual insights. But others might experience more challenging emotions, anxiety, fear, especially if they're not in a good setting or haven't really dealt with some personal issues.
So it's almost like psilocybin amplifies what's already going on inside.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's why set and setting are so important with magic mushrooms. Set is your mindset going in. Setting is the environment. A positive mindset and a safe, comfy setting can really make all the difference.
That makes sense. You wouldn't want to be in like a super crowded, chaotic place if you're having a tough time. But going back to the more enjoyable stuff for a sec, can you tell me more about those visual distortions? Hallucinations even.
Oh, definitely. A lot of that comes from, like we talked about before, how psilocin messes with those serotonin receptors in the brain. It can manifest in all sorts of ways. Imagine colors suddenly becoming way more vivid, or objects that seem to be morphing or breezing, or patterns appearing out of nowhere.
I've even heard people say they feel like they're melting into their surroundings. Is that like a real thing or just a metaphor?
It's more than just a metaphor. Psilocybin can actually change how you perceive your body, like where your body ends and the world begins. Some people feel really heavy, others feel light, almost fluty, like they're merging with everything around them.
Wow, that sounds wild, like disorienting, but fascinating too.
Mm.
It makes you realize these mushrooms can really change how we see reality itself, huh? But how long does all of this usually last?
Well, a typical psilocybin experience, you're looking at about 3 to 8 hours.
3 to 8 hours. So that's a pretty long time to be in an altered state.
Yeah, and time can feel kind of different during the trip, too. But it really does vary a lot. Depends on the dose, the person, all that.
Okay, so speaking of dosage, how much do people actually take usually?
It really depends. Everyone has a different goal, different tolerance, and different mushrooms can be more potent than others. For example, for Psilocybe cubensis, the most common one, a moderate dose is something like 1 to 2.5 grams of dried mushrooms.
So not a microdose then?
No. Microdosing would be way less than that, like tiny amounts. The goal there is to feel kind of subtle effects, not a full-blown trip.
Got it. And what about a strong dose then?
For Psilocybe cubensis, we're looking at maybe 2.5 to 5 grams dried. Anything over 5 grams is a pretty heavy dose. And I gotta say, these are rough estimates. Always start low and slow.
Yeah, definitely don't want to overdo it, especially if you're new to this. We'll have to talk about safety and all that at some point too, right?
Totally. While psilocybin mushrooms are generally considered pretty safe, toxicity-wise, responsible use is still super important. It's a powerful substance, and you got to treat it with respect.
Absolutely. It's not just about the magic. It's about understanding and being safe, right?
Yeah.
But before we get to that, I'm curious about the historical side of things. Like, how long have these mushrooms been around?
Oh, they've been around for a while. There's evidence suggesting their use goes back thousands of years, like way back. Some ancient rock art in Africa and Europe going as far back as maybe 9,000 to 7,000 BCE. Could be depictions of psychedelic mushrooms and what people experienced under their influence. Who knows?
Wow, that's incredibly old.
Yeah, but when we look at the Americas, specifically Mesoamerica, that's where the evidence gets much clearer.
I've heard about indigenous cultures using mushrooms for spiritual stuff in that region.
Exactly. It's well documented that they've been using them in ceremonies, divination, and healing for centuries. We're talking about mushroom stones and motifs found in Guatemala. Pretty cool stuff.
Fascinating how those traditions have lasted.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just small, isolated communities either. Even Moctezuma, the Aztec ruler, reportedly had this special mushroom drink called Tirinacatl at his coronation in 1502.
Tichnanacatl, that sounds familiar.
It means divine mushroom in Nahuatl, the Aztec language. Shows how much reverence they had for these things. But then, sadly, the Spanish conquest happened. Catholic missionaries came in and started suppressing those indigenous practices in the 16th century, seeing it all as demonic.
That's such a shame, a rich cultural tradition just pushed underground like that. But I'm guessing the use of Tichnanacatl never fully disappeared. Seems like these traditions always find a way to survive.
You're right, they persisted in some remote areas, passed down through the generations. But the story doesn't end there. Fast forward a few centuries, and magic mushrooms make a comeback in the West, marking a whole new chapter in their history.
So this is where it gets really interesting. I'm totally fascinated by how psilocybin mushrooms found their way into Western culture.
Oh yeah, it's a great story. And it involves some fascinating people who really brought these fungi to the attention of the Western world.
Well, I can't wait to hear more about that. But I think we've covered a lot already in this first part. We've figured out what psilocybin mushrooms are, what that high is like, and even touched on their long and intriguing history.
It's been quite a ride so far.
It really has, and I'm sure there's much more to come.
Oh, for sure. We've just barely scratched the surface.
So, to everyone listening, stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dive even deeper into the world of psilocybin mushrooms. We'll explore the stories of those who introduced them to the West and dig into the science behind these amazing effects. Welcome back to our deep dive on psilocybin mushrooms. Right before the break, we were talking about how these fungi were basically pushed underground after the Spanish came in. But the story doesn't end there, right?
Not even close. Things get pretty interesting in the mid-20th century. That's when this couple, Valentina Pavlovna Wasson and R. Gordon Wasson, came into the picture.
Oh yeah, I've heard of them.
They are the first European Americans that we know of who actually took part in an indigenous mushroom ceremony in Mexico, and then they brought that knowledge back to the West.
Wow. That's pretty amazing. So they kind of rediscovered this ancient practice and brought it back to a whole new audience. Must have been a pretty mind-blowing experience for them.
Oh, totally. Mind-blowing is putting it lightly. And their journey actually sparked a whole wave of interest in these mushrooms, leading to a ton of research and exploration. In fact, a French mycologist, Roger Heim, he was able to identify that psychoactive mushroom they brought back and said it belonged to the genus Psilocybe.
So that's when the scientific community started paying attention. And I'm guessing this is around the time Albert Hofmann, the guy who discovered LSD, comes in.
You got it. 1958, Hofmann, who had already made history with LSD, managed to isolate psilocybin and psilocin. You know, the active compounds that actually cause the psychedelic effects.
It's amazing how the Wassons' work really kicked off this scientific exploration of psilocybin. So what happened next?
Well, as scientists learned more about psilocybin, they started to understand how it actually worked in the brain. Remember those serotonin receptors we mentioned?
The 5-HT2A receptors, right? The ones psilocin binds to.
Exactly. Research showed that when psilocybin interacts with those receptors, it causes this whole chain reaction in the brain. Neural activity, communication patterns, everything gets altered. It's like, imagine shaking up a snow globe, right? All the usual pathways get all mixed up.
I love that analogy. It really helps me picture how psilocybin kind of disrupts how the brain usually works. So all those crazy visuals, emotional shifts, those changes in perception we talked about, that's all because of these messed up communication patterns in the brain.
Exactly. It's like psilocybin breaks down the normal hierarchy and filtering that goes on in the brain, so all these different regions start talking to each other in ways they normally wouldn't. This leads to senses getting mixed up, unexpected thoughts and emotions popping up, and even this feeling of the self dissolving and merging with the outside world.
So that's why people describe feeling connected to everything around them. Like the barriers between me and everything else just kind of disappear.
That's it. And this disruption of normal brain activity, well, that seems to be a key part of why psilocybin might have some therapeutic potential. It's a really exciting area of research right now.
Yeah. We touched on that a bit earlier, but I definitely want to hear more. There's a lot of buzz about psilocybin possibly being helpful for all sorts of mental health conditions.
Totally. There's growing evidence that when used in a controlled therapeutic environment, it can help treat things like depression, anxiety, addiction, even that end-of-life distress.
It's almost hard to believe that something that was once demonized and illegal could have so much potential for healing and improving mental health. So how are they actually exploring psilocybin as a therapy?
One really promising area is in treating major depression, especially cases where nothing else seems to work. Studies show that psilocybin combined with therapy can really reduce those depressive symptoms, even in people who haven't found relief from traditional antidepressants.
Wow, that's incredible. Real hope for people who've been struggling. What about anxiety? Is it being used for anxiety disorders as well?
They're looking into that too, for a bunch of different anxiety disorders like generalized anxiety disorders, social anxiety, and even PTSD. Research suggests that psilocybin can help people process traumatic memories and emotions in a new way. This can lead to less anxiety and a greater sense of well-being.
It sounds like psilocybin could really change how we approach mental health treatment. But even with all these potential benefits, we have to remember the risks. Earlier, we talked about being responsible. So can we get into some of the downsides, the safety stuff?
Of course, psilocybin is generally considered pretty safe, physically speaking, but there are psychological risks we need to be aware of. Like, remember we talked about bad trips?
Yeah, where people get really anxious, paranoid, even have scary hallucinations. What makes a bad trip more likely to happen?
Well, a lot of it goes back to that set and setting thing. Going into it with a bad mindset, unresolved emotional issues, or being in a place that doesn't feel safe, those things can make a bad experience much more likely.
So preparing yourself and picking the right setting is really important if you want to minimize the risks. What about dosage? Does the amount of psilocybin you take factor into the possibility of a bad trip?
Absolutely. Higher doses usually mean more intense, unpredictable experiences, making a bad trip more likely. Always start with a lower dose, especially if you're new to this whole thing, then maybe increase it gradually depending on how you feel and what you've experienced before.
Makes sense. Respect the power of these mushrooms. Start slow, be cautious. But what about physical risks? Anything to be worried about there?
Well, like I said, psilocybin is generally considered safe in terms of physical toxicity. You'd have to eat a crazy amount of mushrooms to get to a toxic level. But there are other physical things to consider.
Like what?
For one, it can cause changes in heart rate and blood pressure. Most of the time, it's nothing major. But if you have any heart conditions, it's super important to talk to a doctor before even thinking about using psilocybin.
Good point. Better to be safe than sorry. Always get medical advice if you have any health issues. Anything else physically that people should know about?
It can also cause some nausea and vomiting, especially if you take a higher dose. But it usually passes pretty quickly as the effects wear off.
Not fun, but at least it's not usually dangerous. What about the long-term effects of psilocybin use? Are there any known risks or consequences that stick around?
That's a good question. It's something researchers are still looking into. But as far as we know right now, psilocybin mushrooms aren't physically addictive.
That's a relief. But what about, like, a psychological dependence? Could someone become addicted to the experience?
It's possible, but it's not as big a concern as with other substances, things like opioids or stimulants. One reason for that is that psilocybin builds tolerance really quickly.
So if you use it a lot in a short time, it stops working as well.
Exactly. That makes it a lot harder to get hooked on the experience compared to other substances that don't have that tolerance buildup.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's like psilocybin has this built-in protection against addiction. But even if it's not physically addictive, I'm guessing you still need to approach it with some respect and a clear intention.
Absolutely. Even though the addiction risk is low, it's still important to use psilocybin responsibly. Don't use it to avoid dealing with problems in your life.
Yeah, totally agree. It's about exploring, growing, and healing, not just escaping.
Mhm.
So what about the legal side of all this?
Mm.
We know magic mushrooms were outlawed in many places back in the 20th century. Has that changed at all?
That's an important question, and the laws around psilocybin are definitely changing. In most countries, like the US, it's still a Schedule I controlled substance.
Schedule 1, that's the same as heroin, right?
Yeah.
Stuff that's seen as having a high potential for abuse and no medical value.
Yeah, that's right. But lately, there's been a movement to reconsider psilocybin's legal status, partly because of that promising research into its therapeutic benefits we were talking about.
I've heard some cities and even a few states are starting to decriminalize psilocybin. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly. A few cities in the US, like Denver, Oakland, and Santa Cruz, have decriminalized it. That means having or using it isn't a big deal for law enforcement anymore. And Oregon went even further. They created a whole legal framework for using it in therapy, with licensed professionals supervising.
Wow, that's huge. It's like society is changing its view on psilocybin. What was once demonized might actually become recognized for its potential benefits.
It's a pretty amazing shift. It reflects a growing acceptance of psychedelics as valuable tools for healing and personal growth. But even with these changes, psilocybin is still illegal in a lot of places, so it's super important to respect the laws where you live.
Absolutely. Be informed, be responsible, whether you're thinking about using it personally or advocating for better drug policies.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've looked at how psilocybin mushrooms made their way into Western culture, explored how they affect the brain, talked about their therapeutic potential, and even touched on the legal situation, which is constantly evolving.
It's been a fascinating journey, totally. But our exploration of magic mushrooms isn't over yet. There's still more to uncover.
Oh, yeah, we've barely scratched the surface of this fascinating topic.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the world of psilocybin mushrooms. We've explored their fascinating history, the science behind how they affect our brains, and even their potential therapeutic use. Now, before we wrap up, I'd love to hear some of those captivating stories about psilocybin you mentioned earlier. Those historical anecdotes that highlight just how long these mushrooms have been around.
Oh, I've got a few good ones. History is full of interesting stories about magic mushrooms. Like, did you know that back in 1799, a family in London accidentally ate some psilocybe simulantiata for breakfast?
Wait, what? They ate magic mushrooms for breakfast. How did that even happen?
Seems they mistook them for a common edible mushroom.
Oh, no. So what happened? Did they have a bad trip with their morning tea?
Luckily, they were treated by a local apothecary. He wrote in his notes that the youngest kid was having fits of uncontrollable laughter.
That's kind of hilarious, but also scary. It makes you realize that psilocybin has been around for a long time, popping up in unexpected places.
Definitely. It shows how these fungi have always been a part of our world, even if we don't always realize it. And beyond these accidental encounters, psilocybin has really shaped our understanding of the mind and consciousness.
That's true. And speaking of shaping our understanding, we have to give credit to the Wassons, whose story we talked about earlier. They really brought psilocybin to the attention of the West, didn't they?
They were pioneers, that's for sure. Their trip to Mexico in the 50s, participating in those ceremonies and then sharing their experiences through writing and lectures, that really got people in the West interested in psilocybin, both scientifically and culturally. It's like they bridged ancient knowledge with modern science.
And then Albert Hoffman came in, isolated psilocybin and psilocin, and boom. The magic behind the mushrooms had a scientific name.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing how all that paved the way for the research we're seeing today. But before we finish up, I want to touch on something we talked about earlier, set and setting.
Yeah, set and setting, super important to keep in mind when thinking about psilocybin. They can really change the whole experience.
Definitely. So can you remind us what they mean and why they're so crucial?
Sure. Set is all about your mindset going into the experience. You know your expectations, your intentions, your emotional state, even your past experiences. It's that mental and emotional baggage you bring with you.
So if you're going in feeling anxious, those feelings could be amplified during the trip.
Exactly. Psilocybin kind of amplifies your inner world. So a positive, open mindset and dealing with any unresolved emotional stuff beforehand, well, that can be a game changer.
Makes sense. Got to build a solid foundation for the journey. And what about setting?
Setting is about the environment you're in during the experience, feeling safe, comfortable, supported. The setting can have a massive impact on how it all goes.
Yeah, a crazy or unfamiliar environment could totally trigger some anxiety or paranoia, while a peaceful, calm setting might bring out feelings of tranquility and introspection. So something like a cozy living room with close friends or out in nature would be ideal.
You got it. It's all about finding that space that feels right for exploring these altered states of consciousness. And just as important as the physical setting is the social setting. Having a supportive friend around, someone not tripping, can provide some really valuable reassurance and guidance if things get a little too intense.
It's like having a trusted guide for your inner journey, someone to help navigate the rough parts and offer support. It sounds like paying attention to both set and setting is crucial for getting the most out of psilocybin and minimizing any potential risks.
Couldn't agree more. It's about approaching this powerful experience with respect, preparation, and intention. It's not just about having a good time, it's about creating the best possible conditions for a meaningful and maybe even transformative experience.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into psilocybin mushrooms. We've gone through their incredible history, dug into the science behind their effects, talked about how to use them responsibly, and even touched on the changing legal landscape surrounding them.
What a journey.
It really has been. But remember, this is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore when it comes to psilocybin. Its potential for healing, for understanding consciousness, for expanding human potential, it's all still being discovered.
Yeah, it's a super exciting field full of possibilities.
So, to everyone listening, keep those minds curious, stay informed, and approach new information with both excitement and a critical eye.
Ah.
Until next time, happy exploring.